The morning sun cast long shadows across the military hospital courtyard as Marcus Rivera adjusted his Navy SEAL medical kit one final time. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught him that preparation meant survival, and even here at Walter Reed Medical Center, old habits died hard. His calloused fingers moved with practiced precision, checking each bandage, each vial of morphine, each piece of equipment that had saved countless lives in the dusty mountains halfway across the world. Marcus had volunteered for this assignment after his medical discharge. A piece of shrapnel had ended his active duty career, but it couldn't end his desire to serve. Training new military medics felt like the natural next step, a way to pass on the skills that had kept his team alive through some of the worst fighting the war had to offer. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now taught others to save lives in the safety of a sterile classroom. When just 6 months ago he was performing emergency surgery in a bombed-out school building, with Taliban fighters less than a mile away. The first group of trainees filed into the medical training facility, their faces showing the mixture of nervousness and determination that Marcus remembered from his own early days. Most were young, barely out of basic training, their uniforms still crisp and their boots still shining. They carried themselves with the careful posture of soldiers who hadn't yet learned to move with the fluid confidence that came from real combat experience. Marcus began the day's lesson on trauma response, his voice steady and authoritative as he demonstrated proper triage procedures. These soldiers would soon be deployed to active zones where every second mattered, where the difference between life and death often came down to split-second decisions made under impossible pressure. He explained how to prioritize multiple casualties, how to work with limited supplies, how to keep functioning when everything around you is falling apart. In the field, you won't have the luxury of perfect conditions, Marcus told the group, his eyes scanning their attentive faces. You'll be working in the dark under fire with wounded soldiers screaming for help. Your training here will become muscle memory that saves lives when your mind can't think clearly anymore. The morning progressed through various scenarios, each designed to test the trainee's ability to think quickly and act decisively. Marcus watched each student carefully, noting who stayed calm under pressure and who might need additional guidance. He remembered his own instructor, a grizzled Marine medic who had served in Vietnam, and how the man's harsh but effective teaching methods had prepared Marcus for the realities of battlefield medicine. During the lunch break, Marcus stepped outside to clear his head. The peaceful environment of the medical center sometimes felt surreal after years of living in constant danger. Birds sang in the trees that lined the walkways, and families visited their wounded loved ones with flowers and homemade cookies. It was a different world from the one he had known for so long, but it was a world worth protecting. The afternoon session focused on advanced trauma care, specifically dealing with the types of injuries that were becoming increasingly common in modern warfare. Marcus demonstrated techniques for treating blast injuries, explaining how improvised explosive devices created unique patterns of damage that required specialized knowledge to address effectively. He showed them how to recognize the signs of traumatic brain injury, how to stabilize patients with multiple fractures, and how to manage the psychological aspects of treating severely wounded soldiers. As the day wound down, Marcus noticed one particular trainee who had been asking especially thoughtful questions throughout the sessions. The young woman had an intensity about her that reminded him of himself when he was starting out, a quality that suggested she understood the gravity of what she was preparing for. Her uniform bore the insignia of the Army's 82nd Airborne Division, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had already proven herself in demanding circumstances. After dismissing the class, Marcus began organizing his equipment for the next day's training. The familiar routine of checking and rechecking his medical supplies had become a form of meditation, a way to transition from the intensity of teaching to the quieter moments of preparation. Each piece of equipment had a story, a memory attached to a specific moment when it had meant the difference between life and death for someone under his care. The training facility grew quiet as the last of the students departed for their evening meals and study sessions. Marcus found himself thinking about the soldiers he had treated in Afghanistan, wondering how many of them had made it home, how many were struggling with their own recovery processes. The physical wounds were often the easiest to heal. It was the invisible injuries that proved most challenging to address. As he prepared to leave for the day, Marcus caught sight of his reflection in the window of the medical supply room. The face looking back at him showed the wear of years spent in high-stress situations, but his eyes still held the determination that had carried him through the worst moments of his military service. Tomorrow would bring a new group of trainees, new challenges to prepare them for, and new opportunities to pass on the knowledge that had been hard-won through experience. The evening air was cool as Marcus finally locked up the training facility and headed toward his quarters. The base was settling into its nighttime routine, with soldiers finishing their duties and preparing for another day of service. Somewhere in the distance he could hear the sound of evening formation, the familiar cadence of military life that had provided structure and purpose for more years than he cared to count. Marcus knew that his role as an instructor was just as important as his previous work as a combat medic. Perhaps even more so. Every soldier he trained properly would go on to save lives, creating a ripple effect of competence and preparedness that would extend far beyond his direct influence. It was a responsibility he took seriously, understanding that the quality of his instruction could determine whether soldiers would return home to their families or become casualties themselves. The second week of training brought a new intensity to the program, as Marcus introduced live simulation exercises. The medical training facility had been transformed to replicate battlefield conditions, complete with smoke machines, loudspeakers broadcasting the sounds of gunfire and explosions, and actors playing wounded soldiers with realistic makeup and prosthetics. The goal was to create an environment as close to actual combat as possible, without putting the trainees in real danger. Marcus watched from his observation post as the students moved through the simulation, their movements becoming more confident as they applied the techniques they had learned in the classroom. The young woman from the 82nd Airborne caught his attention again, her calm demeanor standing out even as chaos erupted around her. She worked methodically through her triage procedures, prioritizing patients according to the severity of their injuries rather than the volume of their complaints. "Sergeant Thompson," Marcus called out to her during a brief pause in the exercise. "Good work on maintaining focus under pressure. That's exactly the kind of composure you'll need in the field." Sarah Thompson looked up from the simulated casualty she was treating, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool temperature in the training facility. "Thank you, sir. I learned early that panic doesn't save lives. Only preparation and practice do." There was something in her voice that suggested she spoke from experience, though Marcus knew from her file that this was her first deployment preparation. Some soldiers had an intuitive understanding of what it meant to operate under pressure, while others needed more time to develop that capability. Sarah clearly fell into the first category. The simulation continued with a mass casualty scenario, designed to overwhelm the trainee's ability to respond. Marcus had designed this particular exercise based on a real incident from his own deployment, where a suicide bomber had attacked a crowded marketplace near his forward operating base. The memory of that day still haunted him, not because of the violence itself, but because of the impossible choices he had been forced to make about who to treat first when resources were limited. As the exercise progressed, Marcus noticed that Sarah had taken on an unofficial leadership role among her fellow trainees. She was coordinating their efforts, ensuring that no casualties were overlooked while maintaining the systematic approach that would prevent them from becoming overwhelmed by the scope of the disaster. Her ability to remain calm while others struggled with the stress of the simulation impressed him considerably. During the debrief session that followed, Marcus addressed the common mistakes he had observed, emphasizing the importance of clear communication and systematic approaches to mass casualty situations. He explained how the fog of war could make even simple tasks seem impossibly complex, and how adherence to proven procedures could provide an anchor of stability when everything else seemed to be falling apart. In real combat situations, you'll often find yourself making decisions with incomplete information, Marcus told the group. The key is to trust your training and make the best decision you can with what you know at the moment. Second-guessing yourself in the field can be more dangerous than making an imperfect decision quickly. After dismissing the class, Marcus approached Sarah as she was cleaning her equipment. There was a methodical quality to how she cared for her gear that reminded him of veteran medics he had known, soldiers who understood that their tools were extensions of themselves and deserved the same care they would give to their own bodies. "You've got natural instincts for this work," Marcus told her. "Have you considered pursuing advanced medical training after your deployment?" Sarah paused in her cleaning routine, considering the question carefully before responding. I've thought about it, sir. My goal is to be the best medic I can be for my unit. If that means additional training, then I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Marcus nodded approvingly. The best medics he had known shared that attitude, an understanding that their skills directly translated to the survival of their fellow soldiers. It was a responsibility that couldn't be taken lightly, and Sarah seemed to grasp that concept intuitively. As the training program continued, Marcus found himself paying closer attention to Sarah's development. She consistently scored at the top of both written and practical examinations, but more importantly, she displayed the kind of judgment under pressure that couldn't be taught through textbooks alone. Her fellow trainees had begun looking to her for guidance during difficult scenarios, recognizing her natural leadership abilities. One afternoon, during a particularly challenging exercise involving a simulated helicopter crash, Marcus watched as Sarah took charge of a chaotic scene. Multiple casualties with varying degrees of injury lay scattered around the training area, and the other trainees initially seemed paralyzed by the complexity of the situation. Sarah quickly established a triage area, assigned specific tasks to each team member, and began systematically working through the casualties according to standard protocols. What impressed Marcus most was how she adapted when complications arose during the exercise. When one of the wounded soldiers began showing signs of shock that weren't part of the original scenario, Sarah immediately adjusted her priorities and began treating the condition as if it were real. Her ability to think flexibly while maintaining adherence to proper procedures demonstrated exactly the kind of balanced judgment that saved lives in actual combat situations. Other instructors had begun to notice Sarah's exceptional performance as well. During their weekly staff meetings, her name came up frequently as an example of what they hoped to achieve with all their trainees. Marcus found himself feeling proud of her progress, though he was careful not to show favoritism that might undermine her standing with her fellow students. As the training program approached its midpoint, Marcus began incorporating more advanced scenarios that tested not just technical skills, but also psychological resilience. He had learned through hard experience that the most technically proficient medics could still fail under the stress of actual combat if they hadn't been properly prepared for the emotional challenges of battlefield medicine. These exercises were based on situations Marcus had actually faced during his deployments, scenarios where perfect medical decisions were impossible, and medics had to find ways to live with the consequences of their choices. He watched carefully as each trainee grappled with the moral complexity of triage decisions, noting who could maintain their effectiveness despite the emotional weight of their responsibilities. Sarah continued to excel in these more challenging scenarios, but Marcus began to notice subtle changes in her demeanor. The confidence she had displayed early in the program remained, but it was now tempered with a deeper understanding of the gravity of what she was preparing for. She had begun asking more thoughtful questions about the psychological aspects of combat medicine, showing an awareness that technical skills alone wouldn't be sufficient for what lay ahead. The third week brought an unexpected challenge when Marcus received orders to incorporate classified scenarios into the training program. These exercises were based on intelligence reports about new threats that military medics might encounter in upcoming deployments, tactics and weapons that hadn't been part of standard training protocols before. The classified nature of the material meant that security clearances had to be verified and additional briefings were required before the training could proceed. Marcus spent the weekend reviewing the classified materials, his stomach tightening as he read through reports of new chemical agents and unconventional weapons being deployed against American forces. The enemy had evolved their tactics significantly since his own deployments, developing more sophisticated methods of causing casualties that would challenge even experienced medics. He would need to prepare his trainees for threats that he himself had never encountered in combat. When Monday morning arrived, Marcus gathered the trainees in a secure briefing room for an introduction to the classified scenarios they would be practicing. The atmosphere in the room was noticeably different from their usual training sessions, with armed security personnel stationed at the entrances and strict protocols governing the handling of all materials used in the exercises. What you'll learn this week cannot be discussed with anyone who doesn't have the appropriate security clearance, Marcus explained to the group. The scenarios we'll be practicing are based on real threats that you may encounter in your deployments. The information is classified not to make your lives difficult, but to protect the intelligence sources that allow us to prepare you for these situations. Sarah raised her hand during the briefing. Sir, are these threats significantly different from what we've been training for so far? Marcus considered his answer carefully, aware that he needed to prepare them mentally without causing unnecessary anxiety. Some of the medical challenges will be similar to what you've already practiced, but the context and complexity will be more demanding. The key is to apply the same systematic approaches you've already learned, even when facing unfamiliar situations. The first classified exercise involved responding to casualties from a chemical weapons attack. Marcus had set up the training area to simulate the aftermath of a sarin gas deployment, with multiple casualties displaying the specific symptoms associated with nerve agent exposure. The trainees would need to treat the wounded while protecting themselves from contamination, a complex challenge that required careful coordination and adherence to specialized protocols. As the exercise began, Marcus watched the trainees struggle with the additional complexity of working in full chemical protective equipment. The bulky suits made even simple tasks more difficult, and communication was hampered by the gas masks they were required to wear. Several trainees became frustrated with the limitations imposed by the protective gear, but Sarah adapted quickly to the constraints. Remember that your own safety is the first priority, Marcus called out during the exercise. You can't help anyone if you become a casualty yourself. Take the time to properly don your protective equipment before entering the contaminated area. Sarah had established a decontamination area outside the simulated attack zone and was systematically processing casualties through a cleaning procedure before beginning medical treatment. Her methodical approach prevented the spread of contamination while ensuring that wounded soldiers received prompt medical attention. Marcus noted that she had intuitively understood the balance between speed and safety that made the difference between an effective response and a disaster. The psychological impact of the chemical weapons scenario was evident on the faces of several trainees. Working with casualties who were simulating the effects of nerve agent poisoning was disturbing even in a controlled training environment, and Marcus could see some of his students struggling with the emotional weight of what they were practicing. He made mental notes about who might need additional counseling before deployment. During the debrief session, Marcus addressed the psychological challenges directly. What you experienced today was difficult, and it's supposed to be. If you can maintain your effectiveness in these training scenarios, you'll be better prepared for the real thing. But if anyone feels they need to talk through what they experienced, my door is always open. The remainder of the week continued with increasingly challenging classified scenarios, each designed to test different aspects of the trainees' abilities under extreme conditions. They practiced treating casualties from improvised explosive devices that incorporated chemical components, responded to biological weapons attacks, and learned to recognize the signs of exposure to radioactive materials. Throughout these exercises, Sarah continued to distinguish herself, not just through technical competence but through her ability to maintain team cohesion under stress. Marcus observed how other trainees looked to her for guidance when protocols became unclear, and how she provided steady leadership without overstepping her authority as a fellow student. On Friday afternoon, after completing the week's classified training, Marcus called Sarah aside for a private conversation. He'd been thinking about her exceptional performance and wanted to discuss opportunities for advanced training that might be available to her after deployment. Your performance this week has been outstanding, Marcus told her. Have you given any thought to applying for special operations medical training after your deployment? Sarah's eyes widened slightly at the suggestion. Special operations medics receive the most advanced training available in the military, preparing them to work with elite units in the most dangerous situations imaginable. It was an opportunity that was only offered to the most exceptional candidates. I hadn't considered that possibility, sir, Sarah replied honestly. What would that involve? Marcus explained the rigorous selection process and extensive training program that special operations medics underwent. It was a path that would require additional years of service and would likely involve deployments to some of the most dangerous locations in the world, but it would also provide her with skills and experiences that could benefit not just her military career but whatever she chose to do afterward. You have the technical skills and the temperament for that kind of work, Marcus continued, but it's not a decision to make lightly. The demands are significant both professionally and personally. Sarah listened thoughtfully as Marcus described the program. He could see her weighing the possibilities in her mind, considering how such a commitment would affect her future plans. It was exactly the kind of careful consideration that had impressed him throughout her training. "I appreciate you thinking of me for something like that," Sarah said finally. "Can I have some time to think it over?" Marcus nodded. "Of course. There's no rush to decide anything now. Focus on completing this training program and getting through your deployment successfully. The opportunities will still be there when you're ready." As the week ended, Marcus reflected on how much the trainees had developed since the beginning of the program. They had progressed from nervous students struggling with basic procedures to confident medics capable of handling complex scenarios under extreme pressure. Most importantly, they had developed the judgment and resilience that would serve them well in actual combat situations. The classified scenarios had been particularly valuable in preparing them for the realities of modern warfare. The threats they would face in their deployments were constantly evolving, and traditional training programs often lagged behind the tactical innovations of enemy forces. By exposing the trainees to the latest intelligence about enemy capabilities, Marcus had given them the best possible preparation for what they might encounter. Saturday morning brought a brief respite from the intensity of the training program. Marcus used the time to update his lesson plans for the coming week, incorporating lessons learned from the classified exercises into future training scenarios. The program was constantly evolving based on feedback from deployed medics and new intelligence about enemy tactics. The fourth week of training introduced live fire exercises that combined medical scenarios with actual combat conditions. Marcus had coordinated with the base's infantry training units to create realistic environments where trainees would need to provide medical care while live ammunition was being fired overhead. The exercises were carefully controlled for safety, but the psychological impact of working under actual gunfire would provide invaluable preparation for deployment. Marcus briefed the trainees on the additional safety protocols required for live fire exercises, emphasizing that while the scenarios were designed to be realistic, multiple layers of safety measures were in place to prevent accidents. The stress of working with real bullets flying overhead would test their ability to maintain focus on medical procedures while their natural survival instincts urge them to seek cover. "The biggest challenge you'll face today isn't the medical procedures themselves," Marcus explained to the group. "It's learning to function effectively while your body is flooded with adrenaline and your mind is processing multiple threats simultaneously. This is where your training becomes automatic, where muscle memory takes over when conscious thought becomes difficult." The first scenario involved treating casualties in an active firefight, with infantry soldiers engaging targets while medics worked to stabilize wounded personnel. The sound of rifle fire and machine guns created a cacophony that made communication difficult, forcing the trainees to rely on hand signals and established procedures rather than verbal instructions. Sarah moved through the exercise with the same methodical approach that had characterized her performance throughout the training program, but Marcus could see the additional stress of the live fire environment affecting her movements. Her hand shook slightly as she inserted an IV line, and she had to raise her voice significantly to communicate with her patient over the noise of gunfire. What impressed Marcus most was how quickly she adapted to the new stressors. Within minutes of beginning the exercise, Sarah had found ways to compensate for the additional challenges, positioning herself to use her body as a shield for her patients and developing efficient communication methods that worked despite the noise. Her ability to adapt under pressure reinforced his earlier assessment of her potential for advanced training. The live fire exercises continued throughout the week, with each scenario designed to test different aspects of combat medicine under realistic conditions. The trainees practiced medical evacuations under fire, learned to establish casualty collection points in contested areas, and developed techniques for treating patients while wearing full body armor and carrying combat loads. During one particularly challenging exercise, Marcus observed Sarah dealing with a scenario he himself had faced multiple times in Afghanistan. A soldier had been wounded by an improvised explosive device in an area that was still under active enemy observation. Any attempt to provide medical treatment would potentially draw additional fire, but the wounded soldier would die without immediate intervention. Sarah assessed the situation quickly, recognizing that she would need to minimize her exposure time while still providing effective treatment. She gathered the necessary medical supplies and planned her approach carefully, then moved to the casualty with swift, efficient movements that minimized the time she spent in the open. Her treatment was focused on the most critical interventions that could be performed quickly, stabilizing the patient enough for evacuation to a safer location. Marcus made notes about her performance during the exercise, particularly impressed by how she had prioritized her interventions based on the tactical situation rather than just medical considerations. This kind of integrated thinking was essential for combat medics, who needed to understand that perfect medical care was sometimes impossible when tactical considerations demanded compromise. After the exercise, Marcus pulled Sarah aside for feedback. "You handled that scenario very well. What was your thought process when you realized you'd be working under observation?" Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. "I figured I had maybe 30 seconds before they started shooting at me, so I focused on the interventions that would give him the best chance of surviving until I could get him to cover. Everything else could wait." Her answer demonstrated exactly the kind of tactical medical thinking that Marcus hoped to develop in all his trainees. She had understood that her primary goal was to save the patient's life, not to provide perfect medical care according to textbook procedures. That distinction often meant the difference between bringing wounded soldiers home alive and adding additional casualties to the count. The week's training culminated in a complex, multi-day exercise that combined all the elements the trainees had learned throughout the program. They would operate in a simulated forward operating base, responding to various medical emergencies while dealing with ongoing security threats and resource limitations. The exercise was designed to test not just their medical skills but their ability to function as part of a military unit under sustained stress. Marcus assigned Sarah to serve as the senior medic for one of the teams participating in the exercise, giving her responsibility for coordinating medical care across multiple casualties and managing the distribution of limited medical supplies. It was a leadership role that would test her ability to make command decisions under pressure while maintaining the medical expertise that had distinguished her throughout training. The exercise began with a simulated mortar attack on the forward operating base, creating multiple casualties with varying degrees of injury. Sarah immediately began organizing the medical response, establishing triage areas and assigning specific responsibilities to each member of her team. Marcus watched from his observation post as she managed the chaos of the initial response, noting how she maintained situational awareness while focusing on individual patients. As the exercise progressed, additional complications were introduced to test the trainees' adaptability. Medical supplies became contaminated and had to be replaced. Communications equipment failed at critical moments, and security threats forced medical operations to be relocated multiple times. Through each challenge, Sarah demonstrated the kind of flexible leadership that allowed her team to maintain effective medical operations despite constantly changing conditions. On the second day of the exercise, a scenario was introduced that Marcus had not warned the trainees about in advance. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces had begun using female soldiers disguised as medical personnel to conduct suicide attacks on American positions. The trainees would need to balance their humanitarian obligations with security concerns, maintaining their ability to provide medical care while implementing procedures to verify the identity of anyone seeking treatment. Marcus watched carefully as Sarah dealt with this challenging scenario. A simulated casualty was brought to her treatment area by personnel whose uniforms and equipment appeared legitimate, but whose behavior raised subtle questions about their actual identity. Sarah would need to provide medical care while remaining alert to potential security threats, a complex balance that required both medical expertise and tactical awareness. Sarah approached the situation with characteristic methodical thinking. She began providing medical treatment according to standard protocols, while simultaneously implementing identity verification procedures. Her team members were positioned to provide security while she worked, and she maintained constant communication with her command post about the developing situation. The scenario concluded when Sarah's careful verification procedures revealed inconsistencies in the supposed casualties' identification documents. Her adherence to security protocols while maintaining medical readiness had prevented what would have been a successful enemy infiltration in the exercise scenario. During the debrief session that followed the multi-day exercise, Marcus addressed the entire group of trainees about their performance. Most had acquitted themselves well under the challenging conditions, demonstrating that they had absorbed the lessons of the training program and were prepared for the realities of deployment. "You've all grown significantly since the beginning of this program," Marcus told the group. "The skills you've developed here will serve you well in whatever situations you encounter during your deployments. Remember that your training doesn't end when you leave here. Every situation you face in the field will teach you something new about combat medicine." As the formal training program neared its conclusion, Marcus began preparing individualized assessments for each trainee that would accompany them to their deployment assignments. These evaluations would help unit commanders understand each medic's strengths and areas for continued development, ensuring that they were utilized effectively in their new assignments. The final week of training arrived with an unexpected announcement that changed everything. Marcus received urgent orders that morning, requiring him to prepare for immediate deployment to an undisclosed location where his expertise as a special operations medic was needed. The timing couldn't have been worse, coming just as his trainees were preparing for their final evaluations and graduation from the program. Marcus spent the morning briefing his replacement instructor on the status of each trainee, ensuring that the final week of training would proceed smoothly despite his sudden departure. As he reviewed Sarah's file with the incoming instructor, he felt a mixture of pride and regret that he wouldn't be there to see her complete the program that she had excelled in from the beginning. "Sergeant Thompson is ready for anything you can throw at her," Marcus explained to his replacement. "She's got the technical skills, the leadership ability, and the judgment under pressure that you want to see in a combat medic. I'd recommend her for advanced training opportunities without hesitation." The replacement instructor, a Marine veteran with extensive combat experience, nodded as he reviewed the files. "I'll make sure she gets the recognition she deserves." These assessment reports are impressive across the board, but hers stands out significantly. Marcus felt compelled to speak with Sarah privately before his departure, both to congratulate her on her exceptional performance and to encourage her to pursue the advanced training opportunities they had discussed. He found her in the equipment room, methodically cleaning and organizing her medical gear with the same attention to detail that had characterized all her work throughout the program. "I wanted to let you know that I've been called away on short notice," Marcus told her. "Major Harrison will be taking over for the final week and graduation ceremony." Sarah looked up from her equipment, surprise evident on her face. "I'm sorry to hear that, sir. Your instruction has been invaluable. Is everything all right?" Marcus couldn't discuss the classified nature of his deployment, but he wanted to reassure her that his departure had nothing to do with the training program. "It's just the nature of military service. Sometimes you get called up unexpectedly. I wanted to make sure you knew how impressed I've been with your performance throughout this program." "Thank you, sir. That means a lot coming from someone with your experience." Marcus handed her a sealed envelope containing his formal recommendation for special operations medical training. "I've written a detailed recommendation for the advanced training we discussed. When you're ready to take that next step, this should help open doors for you." Sarah accepted the envelope with obvious gratitude. "I've been thinking about what you said, and I believe I'd like to pursue that training after my deployment. Your example has shown me what's possible when someone commits fully to this profession." As Marcus prepared to leave Walter Reed Medical Center, he reflected on how much the training program had meant to him personally. Teaching these dedicated soldiers had provided a sense of purpose that helped him transition from his own combat service to this new phase of his military career. Watching them develop from nervous students into confident medics had reminded him why he had chosen to serve in the first place. The classified nature of his new deployment meant that Marcus couldn't share details with his trainees, but he knew he was being sent somewhere, that his unique combination of special operations and medical experience was critically needed. The urgency of the orders suggested that American forces were facing medical challenges that required immediate expert intervention. Marcus spent his final afternoon at the medical center completing administrative tasks and ensuring that all his training materials were properly organized for his replacement. He had developed many of the lesson plans himself, based on hard-won experience from multiple deployments, and he wanted to make sure that future classes would benefit from those innovations. As evening approached, Marcus made his way to the trainee barracks to say goodbye to the students he had worked with over the past several weeks. Most were studying for their final examinations, and he was struck by how much they had matured since the beginning of the program. The nervous young soldiers who had reported for training had been transformed into confident medics ready to save lives in combat. The trainees gathered around as Marcus addressed them one final time. "I'm proud of each and every one of you. You've worked hard, learned quickly, and developed into the kind of medics that soldiers can depend on when everything goes wrong. Remember that your training doesn't stop here. Every deployment will teach you something new, and you should always be looking for ways to improve your skills." Sarah stepped forward as the informal gathering concluded. "Sir, I wanted you to know that your instruction has changed how I think about being a medic. You've shown us that this isn't just about technical skills, but about leadership and judgment under pressure." Marcus felt a sense of satisfaction that his teaching had made that kind of impact. "You already had those qualities, Sergeant Thompson. I just helped you recognize them. Use them well in your deployment, and don't forget about those advanced training opportunities we discussed." The next morning, Marcus boarded a military transport aircraft bound for his classified destination. As the plane lifted off from Andrews Air Force Base, he thought about the trainees he was leaving behind and hoped that his instruction had prepared them adequately for whatever challenges they would face in their deployments. The flight gave Marcus time to review the classified briefing materials for his new assignment. American forces had encountered a new type of biological weapon that was causing unusual casualties among troops in a specific theater of operations. Traditional medical protocols were proving insufficient to treat the affected soldiers, and Marcus's expertise with unconventional threats was needed to develop new treatment procedures. As the aircraft flew through the night toward his destination, Marcus reflected on the circular nature of his military service. He had gone from being a student learning from experienced instructors to becoming a combat medic saving lives in the field, then to teaching the next generation of medics, and now back to active duty where his accumulated knowledge would be put to the ultimate test. The mission briefing indicated that he would be working directly with special operations units conducting sensitive operations in areas where conventional medical support was not available. It was exactly the kind of challenging assignment that had drawn him to special operations medicine in the first place, combining the highest levels of medical expertise with the tactical demands of elite military operations. Marcus dozed fitfully during the long flight, his mind alternating between thoughts of the trainees he had left behind and anticipation of the challenges that awaited him at his destination. He had learned long ago to compartmentalize his concerns, focusing on the mission at hand while trusting that his previous work would continue to have positive impacts in his absence. As dawn broke outside the aircraft windows, Marcus prepared himself mentally for the transition back to active duty. The teaching assignment had been rewarding, but he was ready to return to the direct application of his medical skills in high-stakes situations. The combination of his recent training experience and his previous combat service had prepared him for whatever he might encounter in this new deployment. The aircraft began its descent toward a military airfield that didn't appear on any civilian maps, and Marcus gathered his equipment in preparation for landing. Within hours, he would be working with wounded soldiers again, applying all the knowledge and experience he had accumulated over years of service to save lives in circumstances that would challenge even the most skilled combat medics. 6 months later, Marcus found himself in a forward operating base in an undisclosed location, where his expertise with unconventional medical threats had been put to the test daily. The biological weapon that had necessitated his deployment had proven to be more complex than initial intelligence had suggested, requiring the development of entirely new treatment protocols and evacuation procedures. His experience training medics had proven invaluable in quickly disseminating new techniques to medical personnel. Throughout the theater of operations, the forward operating base had become a hub for treating casualties from the unusual biological weapon, with Marcus serving as both the primary treating physician and the expert responsible for training other medics in the new procedures. The weapon caused a progressive neurological deterioration that conventional treatments couldn't address, forcing Marcus to experiment with combinations of medications and therapies that pushed the boundaries of field medicine. Working 18-hour days had become routine as Marcus struggled to stay ahead of the evolving threat. Each new case provided additional data about the weapon's effects, but also raised new questions about optimal treatment approaches. He had established protocols for collecting biological samples and coordinating with research facilities back in the United States, creating a feedback loop that allowed rapid refinement of treatment procedures. The stress of dealing with casualties from an unknown biological agent was taking its toll on the medical staff. Marcus had implemented counseling programs and stress management techniques learned from his training experience, recognizing that maintaining morale was essential for sustained operations. The psychological burden of treating soldiers with a condition that was poorly understood was significant, requiring careful attention to the mental health of medical personnel. On a particularly difficult day when 3 soldiers had died despite aggressive treatment, Marcus received an encrypted message that changed everything. A new batch of medical personnel was being deployed to reinforce the forward operating base, including several medics who had completed advanced training programs. Among them was Sergeant Sarah Thompson, now with combat experience from her deployment with the 82nd Airborne. Marcus felt a mixture of excitement and concern about Sarah's arrival. He was eager to work with someone whose abilities he respected, but the current operational environment was more challenging than anything covered in their training program. The biological weapon created medical scenarios that pushed even experienced combat medics to their limits, requiring constant adaptation and innovation. The transport aircraft carrying the new medical personnel arrived during a sandstorm that limited visibility and made landing conditions hazardous. Marcus waited in the medical facility as the new arrivals were processed through the base's security procedures, reviewing the files of the incoming medics to understand their backgrounds and capabilities. Sarah's file showed that she had performed exceptionally during her deployment, earning commendations for her work under fire and her leadership of medical operations. When Sarah finally appeared at the medical facility, Marcus was struck by how much she had changed since their time at Walter Reed. The young soldier who had impressed him with her potential had been transformed by combat experience into a seasoned medic, with a confidence that came from proven performance under fire. Her uniform bore the combat patches and decorations that marked her as a veteran of serious fighting. "Sergeant Thompson, welcome to Forward Operating Base Nightingale," Marcus said as he greeted her. "I hope you're ready for some challenging work." Sarah's face showed recognition and obvious pleasure at seeing her former instructor. "Chief Rivera, it's good to see you again. I heard about the biological weapon situation through intelligence briefings during my transit. What can you tell me about the current treatment protocols?" Marcus spent the next several hours briefing Sarah and the other new arrivals about the unique medical challenges they would be facing. The biological weapon caused symptoms that progressed through distinct phases, each requiring different interventions and careful monitoring. Treatment success depended on early recognition of exposure and immediate implementation of the experimental protocols that Marcus had developed. "The biggest challenge is that every case teaches us something new," Marcus explained to the group. "What worked for one patient might not work for the next, so we need to maintain detailed records and be prepared to modify our approach constantly. This isn't traditional combat medicine, where we have established procedures for most situations." Sarah asked detailed questions about the progression of symptoms and the rationale behind the experimental treatments. Her questions demonstrated that she had continued developing her medical knowledge since completing the training program, showing the kind of intellectual curiosity that Marcus had always believed would serve her well in challenging situations. After the briefing, Marcus assigned Sarah to work directly with him on the most critical cases. Her combat experience, combined with the solid foundation from her training, made her an ideal assistant for developing and refining new treatment procedures. The complexity of the biological weapon required close collaboration between experienced medics who could think creatively about unconventional solutions. Their first case together involved a special operations soldier who had been exposed to a concentrated dose of the biological agent during a reconnaissance mission. The patient was already showing advanced neurological symptoms that indicated a poor prognosis according to current understanding. Marcus and Sarah would need to attempt experimental treatments that pushed the boundaries of field medicine. Working together, they implemented an aggressive treatment protocol that combined multiple experimental medications with supportive care measures. Sarah's steady hands and calm demeanor under pressure allowed Marcus to focus on the complex decision-making required for such an unusual case. Her ability to anticipate his needs and adjust to changing circumstances reminded him why he had recommended her for advanced training. As they worked through the night to stabilize their patient, Marcus found himself impressed by how much Sarah had developed since their time at Walter Reed. Her combat experience had given her an intuitive understanding of how to prioritize interventions under extreme pressure, while her continued medical education had expanded her knowledge of advanced treatment techniques. The patient's condition stabilized just before dawn, representing the first successful treatment of such an advanced case since Marcus had arrived at the forward operating base. The breakthrough provided valuable data about the biological weapon's mechanisms and potential treatment approaches, information that would benefit future cases throughout the theater of operations. That was exceptional work, Marcus told Sarah as they completed their documentation of the case. Your ability to adapt to the experimental protocols while maintaining standard safety measures was exactly what this situation required. Sarah looked exhausted but satisfied with their success. It felt like everything from training and deployment came together in this case. The foundation you provided at Walter Reed, combined with what I learned in combat, prepared me for this kind of challenge. Marcus realized that their successful collaboration represented something significant beyond just treating one patient. Sarah had evolved into the kind of medic he had hoped she would become, someone capable of working at the highest levels of military medicine while maintaining the judgment and adaptability that saved lives in impossible situations. 3 weeks after Sarah's arrival, the forward operating base came under the most intense attack it had experienced since Marcus's deployment began. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces had discovered the location of the medical facility treating biological weapon casualties and were mounting a coordinated assault designed to destroy the research and treatment capabilities that had been developed there. The attack began before dawn with a barrage of mortars and rockets that targeted the medical facility specifically. Marcus and Sarah were working in the intensive care unit when the first explosions shook the building, immediately recognizing that this was not a random harassment attack, but a deliberate attempt to eliminate their medical operations. The precision of the targeting suggested that enemy intelligence had detailed information about the layout and functions of different areas within the base. We need to prepare for mass casualties while protecting our current patients, Marcus shouted over the noise of incoming fire. The enemy knows what we're doing here, and they're trying to stop us. Sarah immediately began implementing emergency protocols for protecting patients who couldn't be moved, while Marcus coordinated with base security about the medical implications of the attack. Several of their patients were in critical condition from biological weapon exposure and couldn't survive evacuation to other facilities. The medical team would need to maintain treatment operations while the base defended itself from assault. As the attack intensified, casualties from the defensive fighting began arriving at the medical facility. Sarah found herself treating conventional combat wounds while simultaneously monitoring patients suffering from biological weapon effects, a complex juggling act that required constant prioritization and resource management. The combination of traditional battlefield medicine with experimental biological weapon treatment pushed their capabilities to the limit. Marcus worked frantically to establish communications with higher headquarters about the critical nature of their research and treatment operations. The experimental protocols they had developed represented months of work and the accumulated knowledge from treating dozens of biological weapon casualties. Losing that information would set back treatment development significantly and potentially cost lives throughout the theater of operations. During a brief lull in the fighting, Marcus noticed that one of the newly arrived casualties was wearing a uniform that seemed somehow familiar. The soldier had been brought in unconscious with severe blast injuries, and his equipment and gear suggested he was part of a special operations unit that had been conducting classified missions in the area. As Marcus began examining the patient, something about the uniform insignia caught his attention. Sarah was working nearby on another casualty when Marcus called her over to assist with the special operations soldier. As she approached, Marcus saw her face change completely, the professional composure she had maintained throughout the attack suddenly cracking, as she recognized something about the patient that he couldn't immediately identify. "Sarah, what is it?" Marcus asked, noticing her unusual reaction to what should have been another routine trauma case. Sarah stood frozen, staring at the uniform insignia on the unconscious soldier's chest. The patch was partially obscured by blood and debris, but enough was visible to trigger a recognition that seemed to shake her to her core. Her hands began trembling slightly, a reaction Marcus had never seen from her even during the most stressful cases they had worked together. I know that unit," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely audible over the ongoing sounds of battle outside. "That's the same Special Operations Group that was operating in my sector during my deployment with the 82nd Airborne." Marcus looked more closely at the patient's uniform, trying to understand what had caused such a strong reaction from Sarah. The unit patches were from an elite special operations team that conducted highly classified missions. The kind of soldiers who operated in the most dangerous areas with minimal support. But there seemed to be something more specific about this particular soldier that had affected Sarah so deeply. As Marcus continued his examination of the patient, he found additional identification that explained Sarah's reaction. The soldier's name tape read Thompson, and his medical records indicated that he was Sarah's younger brother, Michael, who had followed her into military service and earned a place in one of the Army's most elite units. Sarah sank into a nearby chair, the weight of recognizing her brother among the casualties overwhelming her professional training momentarily. Marcus understood immediately why she had frozen. Finding a family member among battlefield casualties was one of the most challenging situations any medic could face, combining professional responsibilities with personal emotions in ways that were almost impossible to manage. "He's been missing for 3 days, Sarah said, her voice stronger now as she processed the situation. His unit was conducting reconnaissance missions to gather intelligence about the biological weapon program. I didn't even know he was in this theater of operations." Marcus made a quick assessment of Michael's injuries, finding severe blast trauma that would require immediate surgical intervention to save his life. The irony wasn't lost on him that Sarah had traveled across the world to this remote forward operating base, only to find herself treating her own brother. A coincidence that seemed almost impossible but reflected the interconnected nature of modern military operations. "Sarah, I need you to make a decision," Marcus said gently but firmly. "You can assist with his treatment, or you can step back and let someone else handle it. Either choice is acceptable, but you need to decide quickly." Sarah took a deep breath and stood up, her professional training reasserting itself over her personal emotions. "He's my brother, but he's also a soldier who needs medical treatment. I can do this." Marcus nodded, recognizing the strength it took for Sarah to compartmentalize her feelings and focus on providing the best possible medical care. Working together, they began the complex process of treating Michael's injuries while the battle continued to rage around the forward operating base. The surgery required all of Marcus's skills as a special operations medic, combined with Sarah's steady assistance despite the personal stakes involved. Michael had suffered internal injuries that required immediate repair, along with blast trauma that threatened multiple organ systems. The complexity of the case was compounded by the ongoing attack, which limited their access to some equipment and created additional stress for the entire medical team. As they worked through the night, Marcus watched Sarah demonstrate the same professional excellence she had shown throughout their time together, even when treating her own family member. Her ability to maintain clinical judgment while dealing with such intense personal emotions reinforced his assessment of her exceptional capabilities as a combat medic. The attack finally ended just as they completed Michael's surgery, with base security forces having successfully repelled the enemy assault. The medical facility had taken some damage, but the critical treatment and research operations had been preserved. More importantly, their patients had survived the attack, including Michael, whose condition had stabilized enough to allow evacuation to a larger medical facility for continued treatment. As dawn broke over the forward operating base, Marcus and Sarah stood together outside the medical facility, both exhausted from the night's events but satisfied that they had saved lives under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The coincidence of Sarah finding her brother among the casualties had tested her professional abilities in ways that no training program could replicate, and she had proven herself capable of maintaining her effectiveness even when facing the ultimate personal stakes. "You did exceptional work tonight," Marcus told Sarah as they watched Michael being loaded onto a medical evacuation helicopter. Your ability to provide professional medical care while dealing with personal emotions shows exactly the kind of character that makes someone an outstanding combat medic. Sarah watched the helicopter disappear into the morning sky, carrying her brother toward recovery and eventual reunion with their family. Everything you taught me at Walter Reed prepared me for this moment, even though I never imagined the circumstances would be so personal. Thank you for believing in me from the beginning. Marcus realized that their journey together had come full circle. From the training facility, where he had recognized Sarah's potential, to this remote forward operating base, where she had proven herself under the ultimate test. The quiet, bleeding soldier they had treated together was her brother, but he represented something more significant about the bonds that connected military medical personnel across time and distance, and the professional excellence that enabled them to save lives regardless of personal cost.